So we'll go ahead and get started. There's a lot to cover tonight. So if you'll remember, we left off last week with looking at the 18 qualities of a perfect or precious human rebirth. The word that's translated from the Tibetan is sometimes translated as perfect and sometimes as precious, but it refers to a human rebirth with those 18 qualities. So now we're going to move on to verse 3, which is here. So, as you can see from the quotation, verse 3 is introducing now the topic of death and impermanence. So, and also karma is here as well. So, we just got done, talking about how amazing our precious human rebirth is. And now we're confronted with the fact that this particular precious human rebirth will not last forever. As we've said previously, we defined impermanence as that which changes moment by moment. So impermanence itself does not, as we said, doesn't by definition mean that something will cease. But with respect to a human body, a side effect of impermanence is unfortunately death. When you apply impermanence to the physical form of the human body, it does mean that at some point that physical form will no longer be a host to consciousness. And when the physical form can no longer be a host to consciousness, body and mind separate, and we call that death. So it is unfortunately the case that our perfect human rebirth, our precious human rebirth, is going to come to an end. When that happens, it says here the results of black and white karma follow. Black and white is just a poetic way of talking about, you could say, constructive karma and destructive karma, positive and negative, virtuous and non-virtuous, different ways of talking about the kinds of karma that we want that is beneficial, and the kinds of karma that we don't want. And essentially, this scheme is another direct observation of the Buddha. The Buddha didn't have his own kind of moralistic ideas about karma. He observed that certain intentional actions disturbed, agitated the mind of the person engaging in them, so brought suffering to the individual, and certain actions tended to also cause suffering for the person that we are relating to, the person that we are engaging in the karmic action in relation toward. And then thirdly, certain all part of the same thing, certain actions tended, negative actions tended to bring a suffering result in the future. So this scheme of karma is based on the Buddha's understanding that we live in a causal universe. And we agree with that with respect to everything that we can interact with. We agree with that in terms of all external events, that things don't come out of nowhere. And it just also happens to be true that the mind is also causal, that the mind also follows this cause and effect logic that the rest of the universe follows. And so when we engage in intentional actions that are, as I said, virtuous, non-virtuous, virtuous or non-virtuous, then it has those three effects. It either disturbs one's own mind if it's a negative or non-virtuous. It leads to harm to others if it's non-virtuous, and it leads to a suffering result in the future if it's non-virtuous. If it's virtuous, then the opposite of all of that is true. It leads to beneficial, pleasant effects in the mind at the time. It causes benefit to others, and in the future, it leads to a beneficial result. So there is then also posited by the Buddha, again through his observation, that the mind and external reality are linked. And so that is what permits that future. So the first two, of course, we can really see those kind of even just through logic, through our own experience. We can see that non-virtuous actions disturb our own mind and they harm others. We can see that virtuous actions support and benefit our own mind and they benefit others. What we can't see is that they bring results in the future. We can't see that through logic or reasoning. It's what's called a deeply hidden phenomena. But the Buddha, being someone who had fully developed his mind and achieved enlightenment, was able to observe that ripening result of intentional actions. So that's what it says here. In particular, at the time of death, a karma will ripen, which will establish a rebirth. A complete karma will ripen and establish a rebirth. Um, and then other karmas will also ripen and they will fill in the details of that rebirth. Is there easy access to resources? Is the life long and healthy? Is it short and maybe full of sickness or ill health? All kinds of effects that fill out the details. And all of that's a karmically driven, karmically established process. So not only do we have to come to terms with the fact that this thing that we possess of extraordinary value is time limited, but we also are being introduced to this engine that drives the process of rebirth, which is the karma or the intentional actions that we cultivate. So we're going to look at verses 3 and 4 together. So verse 4 then, and then we'll circle back and explain in more detail. Verse 4 is finding firm and definite conviction in this. So when we say in this, we mean that, we mean verse 3, that after death, the results of black and white karma follow. So finding firm and definite conviction, basically in the law of cause and effect, then please bless me to always be careful to abandon even the slightest negativities and accomplish all virtuous deeds. So, having generated confidence in the Buddha's teaching on karma, we internalize that teaching by abandoning even the slightest of negativities and trying to find any and all opportunities to engage in virtue. Okay. So I mentioned that at the time of death, a karma will ripen, which will impel a rebirth. That kind of karma has to be what's called a complete karma. There are complete karmas and incomplete karmas. And a complete karma is one that has these four factors together. So we're going to look at what are the four factors of a complete karma. And again, a karma is just any intentional action, an action of body, speech, or mind. So here you can see this sort of diagram that goes through the four features of a complete karma. You begin with the basis. So you observe a particular sentient being and you think that you're going to engage in some action in relation to this. And we talked about this when we talked, for example, about the karma of killing. So you observe a cockroach in your kitchen, and then you develop the second step the intention. So you observe this specific cockroach that is in your kitchen. You're not relating to all cockroaches. It's one cockroach in your kitchen, and you develop an intention. That intention either could be virtuous, i.e., I'm going to pick it up and take it outside, or it could be non-virtuous. I'm going to smash it because I don't care. It's bothering me. I don't. I don't have any regard for the fact that for its life is incredibly precious. It guards its life just like we guard our life. It moves toward um, beneficial stimuli, and it moves away from harmful stimuli just like we do. But we might find it difficult through our past familiarities, our past habits, to take into account, the rights, the needs of the cockroach, and we put our own needs and preferences above that cockroach, and we develop the intention to kill it. Then we engage in an act to bring about whatever result we intend, either to kill it or to protect its life. And then we observe that we did that act, and we observe that it was completed. If we tried to kill it, we took a shoe and we hit it, and then we see the squashed bug on the floor, and we recognize that we've succeeded in killing it. Or we take it outside and we observe that it's just going off into the grass, and living its life undisturbed. We observe that we were successful in bringing about whatever our intention was. So, of these four features, the intention is what's really critical here. Again, going back to this scheme of virtuous and non-virtuous karma, the Buddha, again, didn't invent it. He observed it. He observed how energy that is created in the mind when actions are engaged in, how they move through the mind, and given that the mind and reality have this link, what kind of results flow from that. So it's when we say virtuous, when we say non-virtuous, really what we mean is we use the actions, for example, killing or stealing or lying or being or telling the truth or being kind, saying a kind thing, doing a kind thing. We use those external actions really as a proxy for the intention. Because, again, what the Buddha observed is that it's quite difficult for most people to kill without a negative motivation, a negative intention, an intention that's self-centered, that's selfish, that isn't focused or interested in what is beneficial for the other, but is only kind of seeking what is helpful just only for oneself alone. And that energizing that perspective is not going to bring us closer to enlightenment. It is not going to support spiritual growth and development. It's going to close us off. It's going to solidify our ego identity, and it's going to make it actually harder to achieve enlightenment. And that's really the Buddha's whole deal, is what is it that will bring a person closer or further away from enlightenment? If it will bring us closer, then it's beneficial, it's virtuous. If it will take us away, it is negative, it's harmful. And of course, what is also true is, as I said before, the other sentient being is harmed and our own mind is disturbed. So we can use that as a tool, like, is my own mind agitated? And we can see that these states are actually painful, as compared to the openness, the expansiveness of mind that's there when we take into consideration the needs of the sentient being that we're in relation to. That kind of mind is very spacious, very open, very pleasant, very joyful. And the mind that is closed off from that is very tight, very constrained, very agitated, and very unpleasant to experience. Um, so again, this is really just about, this is a very sort of scientific presentation or understanding of how certain intentions carry with them a certain energy or a certain, resonance, or a particular kind of level of energy. And that kind of closed off, negative, self-centered mind has an energetic effect that's not what we want. And the expansive, open, connected mind has an energetic resonance or energy that we do want, that is going to support spiritual growth and development. So if all four of these factors are complete, then we have established a karmic seed that has the power to impel a rebirth. If one of these are absent, we've still engaged in an action, but the action is a bit weaker. So when it ripens in the future, it can help to fill in the details of a rebirth, but it doesn't have the power to impel a rebirth. Okay, so that's an overview of karma. Any thoughts or questions?
Oh, sorry, it took me a while to
No problem.
navigate to the mute unmute button. Uh, no, I mean I fully understand everything you've said. Well, maybe one thought would be, there's times when I know that I'm making or I think my intention is gonna be a non-virtue, okay? But then as time goes on, I don't implement it. Now, does that count against you? Do you actually have to do the act, or
So we'll see as we go into the next section, because I mentioned, so there's these three doors: body, speech, and mind. So some karmas are just purely mental karmas, and so that's the next section. And so I think it'll get more clear in the next section.
okay, thank you.
Okay, so we're now going to look at what are called the 10 non-virtuous actions. Some of these overlap with the five precepts, the five lay vows that we have looked at, and some of them don't. So I'm not going to reiterate everything that we've already said. I'm going to focus on the new guidelines, ethical guidelines. Um, just to say that the reason that five of these are included in the five lay vows is because those are coarser or more overt actions. And so it's reasonable for a person to say at the time that they go for refuge, at the time that they formally become a Buddhist, that they will no longer, that they'll really make an effort to never again engage in those. They may still fall short, but at least it's reasonable for them to say that they'll really make a strong effort. Whereas if one of those was to never think an unkind thing, that would be unrealistic. And so that would be unreasonable. But it's still a concern, which is why there's five subtler actions that are a concern, but not part of the five lay vows. So we will first look at these three. So again, we've covered all of these. These are the ethical guidelines for the body, which means that you have to use your own body to engage, to create the karma. So do not kill, do not steal, and do not commit sexual misconduct. We've covered all of those before. So then ethical guidelines for your speech, and this means how you communicate. It could be verbal speech, it could be written speech, or it could even be nonverbal communication, but basically transmitting information intentionally to someone else. Where am I? Oh, sorry, I just skipped over it. Okay, so these five, some of which we've covered. So we've covered do not lie, but now we have three new ones, three new ethical guidelines for our speech, which is to not engage in divisive speech, harsh speech, or idle speech. So again, these are not vows that we're taking, but these are, again, the Buddha observed that when we do these things, almost always the reason that we're doing them is because a non-virtuous intention, a very self-centered, very selfish motivation is present in the mind. So again, these are proxies for that internal state. So when we engage in divisive speech, we're trying to separate people. We're trying to set one person against another, or to create some kind of disharmony between people. When we engage in harsh speech, we're trying to use our speech to wound the other person, to say an unkind thing. And then when we engage in idle speech, that is very broad, idle speech. The strictest definition is to really talk about anything that isn't directly connected to like spirituality, which is impossible for people to implement in their lives totally. But it means, so gossip, is included here. Kind of wasting your own time, wasting other people's time, just going on and on about nothing is idle speech. So of course, this is something that we do and something that we're never really going to completely avoid doing, but we can think about how much we're doing it. And we can try to be mindful about, am I kind of wasting this person's time? Am I kind of wasting my own time just because I don't have anything meaningful to say? So it's certainly the case that not everything that comes out of our mouth is going to be this jewel of wisdom that we're imparting. But we can think about, particularly gossip, particularly talking about people behind their backs. How are we using our speech? And is it beneficial? Am I using my speech in a supportive, useful way? If we're trying to make someone, at ease, we're trying to establish a connection, and we're using kind of small talk to do that, then that's okay. But is it sort of, is there some kind of tinge to it that's not so positive? So the Buddha is saying to become aware of how we're using our speech in this way. And so now, like I say, there's purely mental karmas. So for those other karmas, we had to actually do something with our body, or we had to communicate information. Unfortunately, it's also possible to just have a thought and have that be not so great. So these negative mental karmas are covetousness, ill will, and wrong views. So covetousness means to think about the possessions of other people and kind of want to possess them for oneself. This is sort of a greedy mind, a mind that is interested in just accumulating, and particularly things that other people are possessing, like, thinking, well, why does that person have a new car? I wish I had a new car. Maybe I can get them to give me their car, or I can try to find a way to hint that I might like this new thing for my birthday, and maybe they'll get it for me. So it's this kind of greedy mind that's feeding into selfishness. Ill will is not necessarily doing anything to harm anyone, but kind of maybe hoping that something bad will happen to someone. Or if we hear that something bad did happen to someone and we don't like that person, feeling like, well, they deserved it. It's good that that happened to them. So it's wishing ill or thinking ill of a person, even if we engage in no action to cause them to suffer. And then again, I think we've addressed wrong views a little bit when we were talking about the precious human rebirth. So wrong views would be like being not being open to even considering that the Buddha's teachings are um, demonstrating anything that's true about reality, just rejecting them. So it isn't like, well, I'm not sure, or I need more information, or this isn't clear, or I'm not, maybe I'm not ready to implement something. This is a very closed mind that just rejects and says definitely everything that the Buddha said is just something that he made up. Um, and that's, I mean, there's no one's, people can think what they want, and that's fine. But that does, karmically speaking, that would make it very unlikely that a person, of course, would then engage with the Buddha's teachings, either in this life or from the Buddhist perspective, even in future lives. They would be making it more likely that they would meet the Buddhist teachings and that they would engage with the Buddhist teachings. And from the Buddhist perspective, that means that they will continue to participate in cyclic existence for even longer than than they need to, and therefore they would suffer. And also they wouldn't be of the same kind of benefit to others that an enlightened being could be to others. So there are consequences to wrong views in that way. Okay. So there are things and so like you're saying, there are times, of course, that we have this ill will, and if we regret it, if we think, oh, that was a mistaken thought that I had, and the sooner that we can do that, the better. Um, then we've kind of course corrected. Um, but it is true that we lay down a karmic seed in the mind at the time that we have that unkind thought. But did you have a more specific question that you wanted to answer or ask about that?
Um, no, I mean, I think that you just clarified it. But if I did have any kind of a question, it would be, well, just to be real specific, there's somebody actually in my Buddhist community who, to me is like a wolf in sheep's clothing. And she very good way of hiding certain things, but having worked with her on something on tour, and I know she doesn't like me, no doubt about it. I don't like her, and I wish I could find some kind of method to, it's like, I do think about, well, I, have compassion towards her because she's obviously someone who is suffering, to be certain ways, and but it doesn't work to the extent at which I need and want it to work. Um, just like a really hard hump to get over.
I guess I muted myself. Sorry about that.
Oh,
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, everything, all of these guidelines that the Buddha is giving us, they're very difficult to get right all of the time, and that's, it's a lifelong practice. And you definitely, I think you're on the right track that, um, that we're meant to understand that, we, as an ordinary sentient being, we um, have these tendencies, and we also have tendencies in the mind that are not great. We're not always truthful, we're not always as kind, we're not always as generous, and so on. So there's certainly things that we need to work on, and there are people that, and that's true of all ordinary sentient beings, just like this person is also, has things that they're struggling with. We struggle with certain things, and every other sentient being is also struggling with things, and we may have more tools than they do. We may have created certain familiarity, certain habits that are helpful, that they haven't yet been able to create. And so, yeah, as you're saying, trying to hold that with compassion is really the best thing that we can do, to recognize that when we engage in a mistaken action, we are sowing the seed of our suffering. And when they engage in a mistaken action, they're sowing the seeds of their suffering. So we're all kind of in the same boat, maybe just to different degrees and so on. But it's not really a question of a qualitative difference. It's just sort of different points in the same spectrum. And to try to, I don't know if you're familiar with Tonglen practice, or you've tried to, do Tonglen practice in relation to that person. I mean, unfortunately, none of these strategies or antidotes are instantaneous. They take time and repetition in order to be effective. So it really, I mean, it can take months or years of working, with this to see a shift in things.
great, because I know I'm a work in progress. So thank you so much.
Okay. So now we'll talk a little bit about these four features of karma. This applies to all karma, positive and negative. So the first is that karma is definite, which means that when we engage in an action of body, speech, or mind that's intentional, we create a karma, and that karma will, as I said, ripen as experience in the future. If it's a non-virtuous karma, the experience will be suffering. If it's a virtuous karma, the experience will be beneficial, supportive. Um, Except that it that can be interrupted. So if it's not, what it means is if it's not interrupted, then that will happen. It will definitely happen. Um, but with regard to a negative karma, for example, there is what's called purification, which isn't, from my perspective, it's not the best word, because I feel like it's sort of, Judeo-Christian baggage with that word. Um, but what it means is um, cutting off the power, the continuity of that non-virtue. So, and that as a topic is a little bit more advanced than what we have, time for here. But as I did mention, for example, regret. And so if we recognize it as non-virtue, and we regret having done it, then by doing that, we really do reduce that, because the alternative to regret is like rejoicing, like to think, well, it was, that person was rude to me, and so I unloaded with both barrels. And So, and that was right. That, that's what I should have done. And if we have that kind of view, that is not what we want, that. And so we do want to understand it to be a non-virtue and not a virtue. Um, and by thinking of it that way, then we're less likely to do that sort of thing in the future by really reflecting and labeling it correctly as a non-virtue, is one way that we can cut off the power of that continuity of non-virtue. Um, and unfortunately, it's also true with virtue, we can actually regret virtue too, like not intentionally, but if we give, someone money and then, because we wanted to help them, but we kind of thought that maybe they said they would pay us back, but really, we kind of just wanted to help them out, but they said, yeah, when I can, I'll pay you back. And then they don't, and we get angry that they didn't, then we've kind of regretted doing a positive thing. And that is also going to make it less likely that we're going to help somebody out again in the future, because we're going to kind of remember that strong anger that arose at what we did previously. And that's going to steer us kind of away from generosity in that particular example. So it's good to regret harmful actions, non-virtuous actions. It's not good to regret virtuous actions, but it is something that can happen. In either way, it interrupts this definite quality of the karma. It may, what would have brought a positive result because we've regretted it, may now not bring a positive result, or it might bring a less strong positive result. So we do want to regret non-virtue, but we want to really try to avoid regretting virtue. And then similar here means, again, that the effect that comes into the future is going to bear a relationship and violate. A positive karma can never lead to a suffering result, and a negative karma can never lead to a positive result. That correlation is inviolable, according to the Buddha's observation. And then the third is that it's individual, which means that when I create a karma in my mind, then it is the continuity of my own mind that will experience that result. It won't ripen in someone else's mind, which means that anything that I am experiencing was part of the same continuity of this mind, but just most likely in a previous incarnation of this mind. This mind came together with a different form, engaged in an action, and now that action is ripening as the result that I'm experiencing. And similarly, if I create an action now, that action will ripen as an experience that my mind will have, again, most likely in a future incarnation, a future combination of this mind with a different form. And then the fourth is that it expands over time. And this refers to the relationship between the energy, or what seems like the intensity of the act versus the intensity of the result. And this applies to virtuous, and again, all of these apply to virtuous and non-virtuous karma. So, unfortunately, for a negative karma, that means that a small negative karma can, in the future, have what seems like an outsized negative result. But on the flip side, a small virtuous karma can have what seems like an outsized virtuous result, which underscores the importance of, of course, avoiding non-virtue, and then trying to again engage in purification of non-virtues that have been unfortunately created. But then also, again, as we said, finding opportunities to engage in even small virtuous actions. Because over long periods of time, you find that the result is larger than you would otherwise expect. And the example that they give is like an oak tree. You start out with this tiny little seed, and then in 100 years, you have this enormous tree. So it doesn't seem like it's possible that that incredible, huge result could come from that tiny seed, but in fact it can, and with regard to karma, that it does work that way. Um, so, and again, karma, as I said, it's a deeply hidden phenomena. So, there are these aspects. These aspects all refer to that ripening result. So it isn't something that we can puzzle out with logic or with reasoning. It is the Buddha's direct observation, because it is this deeply hidden phenomena. Any questions about the features of karma?
Well, you mentioned the Buddha, and I'm just wondering, I mean, maybe this is impossible to know, but I'm just wondering how he figured out karma.
So, a side effect of achieving full enlightenment, becoming a Buddha. So again, Buddha means the one who is awake, the one who, the fully awakened, fully enlightened being. A feature of that is omniscience. So the Buddha's mind was just capable of knowing all things.
Okay, so when he became a Buddha, then he was able to teach people how it works, basically, how karma
Yeah.
works.
Yeah, I mean, he observed how sentient beings cycle through these different states and why they cycle through these different states. He could actually see in their minds, this action led to this result. Because of this action, this thing happened in the future. And the sutras are littered with the Buddha, explaining these different karmic causes and results with regard to individual people. So yeah, I mean, out of his love and compassion for sentient beings, he taught this scheme that we can use. We can't directly validate all of the complexities of it, but it isn't like the Buddha is telling us to do crazy things, right? He's telling us to be kind, to be generous, and to avoid lying, to avoid killing. It's all pretty reasonable stuff. That it's all pretty much common sense, in terms of, um, you know, also recognizing that it causes suffering for ourselves. It agitates and disturbs our own mind, as well. So, it's not unreasonable to kind of think of karma as a framework that we adopt as a hypothesis, as like, well, what if that is true? What if it does, lead to that? Because all of it is kind of pretty reasonable.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so the next quotation in the Foundation of All Good Qualities. So with that teaching on karma, we have looked at the small scope of the lamrim. We talked about how the lamrim is organized into the small, middling, and great scopes, and we've now finished the small scope. The small scope, again, it is the practices that are engaged in by people who are seeking a good future rebirth. So the wisdom that you need to accomplish that is understanding the precious human rebirth, death and impermanence, karma, and these things. That's what a person needs to accomplish that particular result. But that result is quite limited from the Mahayana Buddhist perspective. So there is this middle scope, and we of course have to engage in the practices of a person of the small scope, but we were encouraged to progress now into the middle scope. So a practitioner on the small scope, they want to create the causes and the conditions of a good future rebirth because they're motivated to avoid the worst kinds of suffering that are possible, as we've said before. Those are rebirths in the lower realms. But a rebirth in the upper realm isn't a picnic compared to either really individual liberation or full enlightenment. Either of those results are preferable to even a rebirth in the upper realm, because we are in the upper realm and we suffer, kind of a lot, particularly again, as compared to those who have achieved individual liberation or full enlightenment. So on the middle scope, we are looking at the disadvantages of remaining in cyclic existence as a whole, even the upper realms. And so we're becoming disenchanted even with the upper realms. And this is called renunciation, or the wish to definitely emerge from all suffering, even the relatively, less intense suffering of the upper realm. So this quotation is saying that samsara is ordinary cyclic existence, all of the states that are options for an ordinary unenlightened mind to experience when we are motivated to seek out what are relative pleasures like good food, a good reputation, a good job, physical comfort, when our life is directed mainly at getting those things, then we are sowing the seeds of our suffering, because we're just going to get more ordinary experiences. We're not creating the causes and the conditions. We're getting enraptured with cyclic existence. We're thinking, well, just good food, just good music, just comfort, that's the best I can do. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to really direct my time, my energy, my efforts to that. And then we are blocking ourselves from what's possible from full enlightenment, from the Mahayana perspective. So we're really meant then to turn away from that kind of orientation, from that kind of from making the focus of our life sensory pleasure, and instead making the focus of our life spiritual growth and development, making that central to our life, and not just sort of hedonistic hamster wheel of trying to accumulate more things and better things, and more power, more wealth, more enjoyment. That, from the Buddhist perspective, shouldn't be at the core of what we're trying to do. So, and these are actually, sorry, those were reversed. Or were those the ones that were reversed? No. Sorry. Something here was reversed, I thought, and I was going to fix it. Okay. So when we say, so this pure thought is maybe so I'm sorry, maybe these were the two that were reversed. So yeah, okay. So everything that I just said was true, but I'm sorry, I meant to reverse the order of these two because this card, this quotation, refers to the pure thought of guarding our karma, which is the previous topic. So uh, when we're led by that pure thought of guarding our karma, then we really become cautious and we really try to avoid non-virtue and engage in virtue. Um, and the pratimoksha vows are again the individual liberation vows, the vow to not kill, steal, lie, commit sexual misconduct, or take intoxicants. That's the foundation of the Buddha's ethical teachings. And so we essentially, when we really understand karma in a as deeply as we can, then we take that on board and we live our life in accordance with the law of karma. So that, I'm sorry, that is kind of what finishes the previous section. And now, as I said, we are looking at the middle scope, which is everything that I had said about whether or not essentially sense pleasure is the core of our life or not. And when we turn away from making sense pleasure the real core of our life, then we develop the time and the space and the energy to put, enthusiasm and energy toward, as it says here, the bliss of liberation, or really trying to create the causes and the conditions karmically, not for more ordinary rebirths, even within the upper realms, but really for going for enlightenment, for making enlightenment the kind of focus of our life. And that's really what the middle scope is about, is this idea of seeing that, up until now, I've really been motivated just to get more pleasure, just more comfort, more things that are enjoyable. And that, it's true that comparatively speaking, that's better. It's better to have a house than not have a house. It's better to have food than not have food. But if we go too far and we only think about getting more and more and better of these things, we're feeding into creating the causes and the conditions of more ordinary rebirths, and not creating the causes and the conditions for achieving enlightenment. So we turn away from making that the central focus of our lives, um, and that's, as I said, the wish to definitely emerge from suffering, to just say, when I get caught up in all of that hedonism, it's going to only be suffering. I think it's pleasure. I think that having more, having better, is the purpose of my life, is pleasure, but really it's suffering. And if you go back to where we talked in the Four Noble Truths about the three kinds of suffering, it's the suffering of change. So now, on the basis of the small scope, we're really energizing ourselves to just achieve enlightenment. And that's really the only thing that we're going to say about this middle scope. Any questions about the middle scope?
No, thank you.
Okay, so now we're actually going to move right to the great scope. So again, the small scope, that practitioner was motivated to achieve good future rebirths because of their fear of the lower realms. The middle scope practitioner develops kind of a fear, a weariness of any ordinary rebirth, and they only want enlightenment. And now on the great scope, that person is maturing even further. Those are we're continually trying to mature and refine our motivation. So we recognize that I could, I could be a Buddhist, I could follow the Buddhist teachings, and I could achieve individual liberation because that is a path that the Buddha taught in the sutras. The Buddha to certain disciples taught the path of individual liberation. So this weariness of ordinary cyclic existence could lead me to that, could lead me to the vehicle of individual liberation. But it could also lead me to what's called the great vehicle. So you have individual liberation, the individual vehicle, or you have the great vehicle. The great vehicle is a vehicle that requires this refinement of motivation, where we recognize that if I did achieve individual liberation, I wouldn't be of benefit to all of the other ordinary sentient beings who would continue to experience those sufferings that we just became weary of, all of those negative, not so great experiences that we've just turned away from creating the causes and the conditions of. They're still creating those causes and those conditions. They haven't developed definite emergence, the wish to definitely emerge from suffering. So, here it says, just as I am participating in cyclic existence, so are all other. Here it says mother migratory beings, mother being, and we'll look at that a little bit later today. This idea that all other sentient beings have been one's own mother in previous lives. That's the meaning of mother here, my own mother. So in the same, and so we're meant to really develop this connection to sentient beings using this understanding that in previous lives they have literally played the role of one's own mother. And just like if our own mother was in danger, we would feel compassion. We would feel the urge to, because of the kindness of, that our mother has shown us in this life. So now, of course, with that can require some also training, because humans are fallible and our parents were fallible and they made mistakes, and we it's not uncommon that people focus on those mistakes. But it is the case that our parents, they provided, they protect, they kept us alive, they protected, and so on. And, unavoidably, it's true that there are examples of parents who do really, really terrible things. That's unavoidably true. And that, so under certain circumstances, of course, that can be an obstacle. So if we need to deal with an obstacle like that, then we try to find some sort of role model, some sort of, someone that was a caregiver. But in general, broadly speaking, parents, they do their best to provide for food and shelter and education, and they've created, we're alive. So they've given us this body that we can use to achieve enlightenment in. So there are kindnesses, and we try to focus on the kindnesses. And we recognize that in general, most of the time, that relationship is born out of those kindnesses, for the most part, even though there's fallibility and there are mistakes, of course, that are made. So on the great scope, we turn away also from individual liberation. We turn toward full enlightenment, the great vehicle, because with the great vehicle, we do accomplish our own welfare, just like we would if we followed the individual vehicle. Both vehicles result in oneself being free of cyclic existence. So oneself ceases to suffer, regardless of which vehicle one masters or accomplishes, achieves. But with the individual vehicle, that mind, that consciousness that is free of suffering, is cut off from cyclic existence. A fully enlightened being is not cut off from cyclic existence. They don't participate in it in the same way as an ordinary sentient being, but they can, as a fully enlightened being, they can choose to re-enter cyclic existence. They can choose to appear within cyclic existence for the benefit of ordinary sentient beings. And when we consider how kind sentient beings have been to us, we want to be of benefit to them in that way. We don't want to just accomplish our own welfare and leave them to their own suffering. We want to accomplish a state that allows us to be of benefit to them. So we refine our motivation yet again, and we become particularly energized toward full enlightenment rather than the individual vehicle. Okay. I know that's a lot of information. Any thoughts or questions?
I was just wondering, on the middle scope, is that when somebody achieves nirvana and they just like stay there?
Yes, it would be for a practitioner who's not going to graduate to the great scope. So the practices that you find on the small scope and on the middle scope, those are practices that are generally held by practitioners who are going to practice the individual vehicle. They need all of those practices, the ones on the small scope, the ones on the intermediate scope. We also need all of those practices on the small scope and on the intermediate scope. But what a practitioner who's going to accomplish the individual vehicle would do is we've talked about how ultimately Buddhism is trying to get people to see the nature of reality directly. That is something that a practitioner of the individual vehicle also has to do. A practitioner of the great vehicle or the individual vehicle, they both have to see the nature of reality directly. So they would include that topic on what you would call the middle scope for them, because there is no great scope for them. The great scope is unique to the Mahayana tradition. For those who are aiming eventually to practice the great vehicle on the great scope, the contemplation that leads to seeing the nature of reality directly is moved to the great scope. It's part of the great scope. But there is no great scope, as I say, for a practitioner who is aiming to individual enlightenment or the individual vehicle. So they would have to practice that as part after they've developed that weariness, that renunciation. They would then put their effort into seeing the nature of reality directly. They would move from that renunciation directly to seeing the nature of reality directly. If a person is going to aim to the great vehicle, they go from the renunciation, that wish to definitely emerge from suffering. They go into developing the wish to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, which is bodhicitta, which was in that slide, this past slide. Please bless me to see this and train in supreme bodhicitta and bear the responsibility for freeing migratory beings. So for a person who knows or is intending to practice the great vehicle, they move from renunciation to trying to develop this bodhicitta, which again, the definition of bodhicitta is the wish or the aspiration to achieve full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, um, so that all other sentient beings can also achieve enlightenment. That's what's meant by freeing migratory beings. We recognize that that's how you stop suffering, that's the way in which you are free from suffering is full enlightenment. So we aim toward it, but we aim toward it not for our own sake, but to have the tools and the ability to work for the benefit of ordinary sentient beings, and therefore to free them from suffering by bringing them also into the fully enlightened state. Which is what the Buddhas do. That's what Shakyamuni Buddha did. That's what all of the Buddhas do. All they can really do is show people what to practice and what to abandon. They show people how to train their mind. But still, all of those people have to train their own mind. We have to train our own mind, and all other sentient beings have to train their own mind. But fully enlightened beings, as I said, they're omniscient. So they know the minds of all sentient beings. They know what methods to give sentient beings, what practices, what to say, how to say it, how to skillfully, perfectly lead sentient beings. Those sentient beings have to do all of their own work. But when they're led by fully enlightened beings, it works out much better than, because who could have come up with all of this but the Buddha, we certainly couldn't have come up with it. So we want to become someone who is that skillful, who has that ability, who has those tools to bring to bear in their efforts to be of benefit.
Okay, yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Okay, so there's a little bit of a caveat, though, of course. We do want to train in bodhicitta. Um, in order to do that, the most immediate cause, of course, we have to really master the small scope and the middle scope, or we'll never get to this, because if we don't have definite emergence, the wish to definitely emerge from suffering, we're going to still be caught up in accumulating sense pleasure. That's going to still be the core of what we think is important. And so we have to overcome that with definite emergence. So all of the small scope and the middle scope are necessary prerequisites to bodhicitta, but the most immediate prerequisite is what's called developing equanimity, which means that we equalize our regard for all sentient beings. So ordinarily, we have a lot of regard for people that we think have benefited us. We don't have a lot of care or regard for people that are neutral to us, strangers, people that we just see on the street, on the subway, in the store. Like, we don't wish them ill, but we're also not going to help them move. Like, we're pretty neutral about it. And then there are people that we feel like have acted against our interests, and we actually have kind of ill will toward those people. So we label sentient beings, we put them into the categories of friend, enemy, and stranger. And that's a real obstacle to developing the wish to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, because we're stuck in this labeling scheme that's very ingrained in us. It's very difficult to overcome this desire to put people into these baskets of friend, enemy, and stranger. But we need to. We have to equalize our regard for them. So we literally try to analyze, like, does that make sense? Is that reasonable? Is it reasonable to reduce sentient beings simply to whether or not they have acted for my own benefit. Does that make any logical sense? Of course, it makes no logical sense to say that how I treat people, how I think about them, whether I have compassion for them or not, is only based on their relationship with, out of the trillions and trillions of sentient beings, just oneself. Um, so it's a deeply ingrained habit that we all have, but we can overcome it by really thinking deeply about it and trying to, and then also um, using those categories, using the fact that we know how to feel warmly toward some sentient beings. We know how to feel compassionately toward some sentient beings. We have the spark of that already in the mind. So we can also cause that to arise by thinking about those sentient beings and then just kind of pretending that we feel that way toward other sentient beings. If we pretend over and over again in meditation by using the thoughts, the feelings, the subjective experience of compassion, of love, of kindness that we naturally, spontaneously feel towards some sentient beings, over time, through training, through effort, we can generalize how we relate to sentient beings. Um, so it is possible to expand the seeds of love and compassion and so on that we possess, expand them to embrace all sentient beings and develop that equal regard. And then it becomes possible to actually train in bodhicitta. Okay. So I'm going to briefly go through um, how a person trains in bodhicitta. So it's called the 6 causes and 1 effect. So there are 6, we try to generate 6 causes in the mind through meditation, and it leads to the effect of bodhicitta. So again, the first, as I mentioned, is that we literally try to think of every single sentient being as having played the role of one's own mother in previous lives. Um, and again, focusing on their kindness, not focusing on the mistakes that they might have made, but focusing on the fact that, they gave us food and clothing and shelter and education and so on, the kind of the ordinary kindnesses of the parent, the mother, the caregiver. So we're trying to see all sentient beings in a warm, positive light in that regard. And again, this is considered from the Buddhist perspective to be literally true, that all other sentient beings, their minds inhabited the body of a person or of a sentient being that was the sentient being who was one's own mother, one's own father, etc. It's presented as a literally true sort of mathematical statement in Buddhism. Um, so it isn't something that the Buddha is saying, well, just make this up, and just think this way. The Buddha is saying this is true. This happened. This is a fact. And when our own mother, our own mother in this life may have, could still be living, may have passed. But if and when the mother in this life does pass, when we look at a photograph of that person, we would say, well, that's my mother. We wouldn't say, well, that used to be my mother, or we would say that is my mother. And so that survives death, right? Like that person maybe has passed or will pass, but still, when we think of that person, or we look at a photo of that person, that's our mother. And so the fact that that we've also passed from those previous lives and they've also passed, it doesn't change the fact that there was that relationship, that it really did happen. All of those kindnesses really did happen, objectively, factually. So it's valid. It's just objectively valid to say all sentient beings have been my mother. And therefore, to try to train in regarding them in that warm, positive way, which is going to help, to cultivate the wish to be of benefit to them. Okay. Oops. So then step two then is, so we first just recognize that all sentient beings have been our mother. Then we focus on those kindnesses, as I mentioned. That's step two, is we really try to bring to mind as many different examples of kindness as we can to generate that warm-heartedness. And then step three is generating the wish to repay their kindness, thinking that we've received so much benefit from every single sentient being. What can I do to repay them? They've raised me, they've protected me, they've kept me safe, they've clothed me, they've fed me from their own bodies. What can I do to repay that kindness? And then we generate a real sense of love, a real sense of thinking about these kind mother sentient beings that we want to repay, thinking that they meet with suffering again and again, that they are bereft of real true happiness. So we want to repay them. We want to repay them from their kindness. And when we think about what they're going through, what their lives are like, we see that just like oneself, they meet with suffering again and again. They never are really, truly, fully satisfied, really content, really, genuinely full of bliss and contentment. So we wish those things for them. Love in Buddhism, the definition of love is the wish for oneself and all other sentient beings to have happiness and the causes of happiness. And compassion, which is step five, is the wish for oneself and all other sentient beings to be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. So we think about all of the ways in which these kind mother sentient beings that we wish to benefit, all of the ways in which they suffer and are prevented from being happy. And we really, from the depth of our heart, we really try to wish them to have happiness and to be free of suffering. And then we think, I myself take responsibility for bringing that about. We think it isn't sufficient for me to just wish for them to be happy and just wish for them to be free of suffering. I have to actually bring it about. Even by myself alone, I will install all sentient beings in a state in which they are actually in possession of the causes of happiness, and they are in possession of the causes of being completely free or protected from all suffering. I'm not going to just hope that they experience that. I'm not going to just hope that some other sentient being comes along and accomplishes that. They were kind to me, and I want to repay that. The best way that I can repay that is to, after having recognized how they suffer, how they've been prevented from being truly happy, to create those causes and those conditions for them. And then we think, can I do that? Is that something? Oh, sorry, I guess I don't have a slide that shows the result, but you could say step 7 is then bodhicitta. These are the 6 causes. They lead to a person developing bodhicitta. So they do that because then a person thinks, you think, am I capable? This is now, I've laid all of this out, and this is what I want. Can I actually do it? Is it, is there a way? Like, how what would I do that would cause that to happen? This is what I've said I want, but how do I do that? And the only way in which it's possible to do that is for all of these sentient beings to achieve enlightenment. If they don't achieve enlightenment, they won't accomplish that. And so we see that that's true. And so we then recognize, well, I can't actually lead them to their enlightenment unless I myself am enlightened, because I myself, uh, I have anger in my mind, I have jealousy in my mind, I have all of these tendencies, these habits that are not great, that are causing me to suffer, that are keeping me trapped in cyclic existence. And and so my ability to carry out my own wishes is really limited right now in this moment. It wouldn't be limited, though, if I achieved enlightenment. And only if I achieved enlightenment would it not be limited. So I then, in order to do what I said I wanted to do, in order to be able to lead all sentient beings to their enlightenment, I have to achieve my enlightenment. So now all of our activity, our actions become um, directed at achieving one's own enlightenment, not for one's own benefit, but to gain the ability to be of perfect benefit to these kind mother sentient beings. And so that is bodhicitta. That is how you train in bodhicitta, is through the 6 causes and 1 effect meditation. Okay. So I thought it was likely that we were going to run out of time, and we are. It's difficult to do this class in 4 sessions, but so anyway, that's a larger. So what I can do is I can try to find. Do you have any questions that you would? Probably you have questions. It's so much information.
Actually, I don't. I mean, I'm not like a novice in
Mhm,
Buddhism, but I do like come back to courses because it's just the way I learn. Because
mhm,
you can take a class, um, and then you know several years later take the same class and learn new things.
mhm.
So no, but everything. I don't have any questions. So thank you.
Let me see if I can find. Okay. Let me see. So what I'll do, I'm having trouble finding it, but what I'll do is there's generally sometimes we do this in 5 sessions, like I say, and that makes it easier to cover the remaining material, like of course in particular the wisdom realizing the nature of reality, which we've not covered. And so there's a few things that we've not covered, and that's of course that's the main topic, but it takes about half an hour of like just straight going through it to try to make sense of it. And you probably come across it anyway. I know that there's a recording of a class 5 that I can find. And So when we post this class, class 4, on the YouTube channel, in the description of class 4, we will post the link to class 5. Of course, it's a prior class, but it's going to cover the material that I didn't have time to cover. And so of course, if you're interested, you can watch that. And if you have any questions about that, you can email me. My email address, and that's true of anyone who's just watching the video. If you watch class 5 and you have any questions and you'd like to email me, it's SPC, Sam Patrick Charlie, at tnlsf.org. Tina, Nancy, Larry, Santa Fe, Frank, .org, tnlsf.org. SPC at tnlsf.org. So if you have any questions about the 5th class, but yeah, it's really difficult. It's kind of meant to be done in 5 classes, but we try to switch them monthly, and so it can be a little bit tricky.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Oh, sure, of course. So, yeah. Anything I can help with?
You've been a big help, tonight by giving me the class and giving me, some personal assistance and growth and development. Thank you.
All right, well, sure. Well, I hope you feel much better very quickly.
Thank you. Yeah.
Have a good night. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too, Venerable. Thank you so much.
Bye.